If you took an average Neanderthal male, gave him a haircut, shaved his beard, and put him in a tailored suit on the New York subway, nobody would think they were looking at a caveman. They would just think they were looking at an extremely intense, terrifyingly built NFL linebacker. For the last century, pop culture has completely butchered the Neanderthal. We turned them into the Geico caveman. We built museum dioramas showing them as hunched, grunting brutes dragging clubs around. We use their name as an insult for people who don't know how to use turn signals. But the biological reality is that for roughly 300,000 years, Neanderthals were the undisputed heavyweight champions of Ice Age Europe. They were apex predators. Their bone density was so absurdly high that anthropologists have compared their skeletal strength to modern professional rodeo riders. They had perfectly adapted internal heating systems for the freezing tundra. And here is the most uncomfortable biological fact of all. On average, Neanderthals actually had bigger brains than modern humans do. By all standard evolutionary logic, when Homo sapiens wandered out of Africa and bumped into the Neanderthals in the Middle East and Europe, we should have been a pathetic footnote in their history book. They were stronger. They had the home field advantage, and they had been surviving the Ice Age for hundreds of thousands of years before we even showed up. Yet today, we are the ones building megacities and launching rockets, and the Neanderthals are dead. If natural selection is a hyper-efficient machine designed to maximize survival, why didn't evolution save the ultimate survivors? To understand how they died, you first have to respect how they lived. For a long time, the scientific consensus was that Neanderthals were basically just scavengers, that they survived by picking meat off the bones of animals that wolves or saber-toothed cats had already killed. But in the year 2000, researchers conducted stable isotope analyses on Neanderthal bones found in Europe. They measured the levels of carbon and nitrogen, 15 isotopes locked in the collagen of their skeletons. In the animal kingdom, nitrogen-15 acts like a biotracker. The higher up the food chain you are, the higher your nitrogen levels. The results were staggering. The Neanderthals' nitrogen levels didn't match scavengers. They perfectly matched wolves, hyenas, and big cats. Neanderthals were top-tier, hyper-carnivorous apex predators. They were regularly taking down woolly mammoths, woolly rhinos, and wild horses using heavy thrusting spears. They weren't stupid either. Evidence shows they were manufacturing birch tar pitch, the world's first synthetic glue, to attach stone points to their spears. Making birch tar requires heating bark at highly specific temperatures in an oxygen-free environment. That is Paleolithic chemistry. But their physical dominance was actually a biological time bomb. In biology, there is no such thing as a free lunch. Maintaining a massive, hyper-muscular body in a freezing environment requires an astronomical amount of fuel. Anthropologists estimate that an active Neanderthal hunter required somewhere between 4,000 to 5,500 calories every single day just to survive. For 300,000 years, this wasn't a problem. Europe was packed with massive, slow-moving megafauna, but around 40,000 years ago, a climatic event known as marine isotope stage 3 hit Europe. The climate began to violently flicker. Forests rapidly died off, turning into vast, open, barren tundras. The mammoth and rhino populations plummeted. Suddenly, the Neanderthals' ambush hunting strategy collapsed. You can't ambush a fast-moving reindeer on an open plain when you weigh 200 pounds of solid muscle. Meanwhile, Homo sapiens were migrating into these exact same territories, and our bodies were built differently. We were taller, leaner, and designed for long-distance endurance running. We were the biological equivalent of a Toyota Prius, and the Neanderthals were a Hummer. When the gas station ran out of fuel, the Hummer starved. Our leaner ancestors could travel efficiently over massive distances to scavenge, track smaller prey, and survive on a fraction of the calories. But diet alone doesn't wipe out an entire species. To understand the real extinction event, we have to look at one of the biggest paradigm shifts in the history of science. Up until the late 1980s, you couldn't get a degree in anthropology without learning the multiregional hypothesis. This was the prevailing theory that early hominids spread out across the globe millions of years ago and then slowly, gradually morphed into modern humans everywhere at the same time. According to this model, the Neanderthals didn't really go extinct. They just slowly evolved into modern Europeans. But two researchers, Chris Stringer and Peter Andrews, thought this was completely wrong. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, Stringer was traveling across Europe, measuring thousands of ancient skulls with calipers. He realized that Neanderthal skulls and modern human skulls weren't blending into each other in the fossil record. They looked like two completely different species. In 1988, Stringer and Andrews published a bombshell paper in the journal Science outlining the Out of Africa model. They argued that Homo sapiens evolved entirely in Africa as a completely new, distinct species. When we finally migrated into Europe, we didn't politely merge with the local Neanderthals over 1 million years. We showed up fully formed, and we entirely replaced them in a geologic blink of an eye. In his foundational textbook on human evolution, anthropologist Roger Lewin outlines exactly how this replacement happened. It wasn't just that we were more energy efficient. We possessed a fatal weapon that the Neanderthals lacked: the social firewall. Archaeological data from caves like El Sidrón in Spain shows us exactly how Neanderthals lived. They lived in incredibly small, highly isolated bands of maybe 10 to 15 people. The stone tools they used were almost exclusively made from local materials, meaning they rarely travelled far from their home base. Genetic testing of these remains shows severe inbreeding. They were totally disconnected from each other. Homo sapiens operated like a globalized startup. We maintained vast, interconnected social networks. Archaeologists regularly find Homo sapiens tools made from specific types of flint, alongside seashells, hundreds of miles away from where those materials originated. That means we were trading. We were communicating across tribal lines. In the brutal calculus of evolution, social networks are the ultimate insurance policy. If a Neanderthal valley experienced a harsh winter and the local deer population collapsed, that isolated Neanderthal group simply starved to death and vanished. If a Homo sapiens group faced that exact same localized famine, they didn't die. They relied on neighboring tribes for support, they traded for food, and they survived. We built a societal firewall against extinction. We didn't beat the Neanderthals by overpowering them in physical combat. We beat them with logistics, networking, and supply chain management. For decades after the 1988 Stringer and Andrews paper, the replacement theory was gospel. We migrated out of Africa. We outcompeted the Neanderthals for resources, and we drove them into the ground. A clean, brutal, Darwinian victory. But science is rarely that clean. Enter a geneticist named Svante Pääbo. For years, Pääbo was obsessed with trying to extract DNA from ancient bones. Most scientists thought this was impossible. DNA degrades over tens of thousands of years, and ancient bones are overwhelmingly contaminated with the DNA of modern bacteria and the archaeologists who handled them. But Pääbo built ultra-sterile clean rooms, developed revolutionary sequencing techniques, and started drilling into 40,000-year-old Neanderthal bones. In 2010, Pääbo and his team published the first draft of the Neanderthal genome, a feat that would eventually win him the Nobel Prize in 2022. When scientists laid the Neanderthal genome next to the modern Homo sapiens genome, they found something that forced anthropologists to rewrite the textbooks all over again. The replacement wasn't absolute. When Homo sapiens migrated out of Africa, and encountered Neanderthals in the Middle East and Europe, they didn't just compete for resources, they interbred. The Neanderthals didn't just get physically out-competed, they got demographically swallowed. Homo sapiens were migrating in such massive numbers and breeding so rapidly that the much smaller, isolated Neanderthal populations were essentially absorbed into our massive gene pool. Evolution didn't save them as an independent species, but it didn't completely erase them either, more like a hostile corporate merger. The smaller company was completely dissolved, the brand name was retired, but the parent company kept a few vital lines of their code. If you have European or Asian ancestry, roughly 1 to 2% of your DNA is distinctly Neanderthal. And this wasn't junk DNA. We actively utilized their genetics to survive. Because Neanderthals had been living in Europe for hundreds of thousands of years before we arrived, they had already evolved resistance to local European viruses and pathogens. When we bred with them, we essentially downloaded their immune system. We acquired their HLA genes, which gave our immune systems a massive boost. And we absorbed their keratin genes, which changed our skin and hair to better protect us against the freezing European climate. We used their own biological patents to survive in their territory. So, why didn't evolution save the Neanderthals? When we look back at our extinct cousins, we are forced to redefine what survival of the fittest actually means. We culturally assume that evolution favors the biggest, the strongest, and the most physically unbreakable individuals. The Neanderthals had all of that. They were biological tanks, perfectly adapted to their environment. But evolution is a numbers game, and it is entirely unsentimental. Being physically unbreakable doesn't matter if your body requires an unsustainable amount of energy. Being an apex predator doesn't matter if the climate shifts and your prey goes extinct. And being the strongest species in the valley doesn't matter if your population is isolated and refuses to adapt. Evolution didn't save the Neanderthals because natural selection doesn't reward raw strength. It rewards flexibility. Homo sapiens conquered the planet not because we were tougher, but because we were incredibly efficient, wildly social, and unapologetically opportunistic. We survived because we required fewer calories. We built vast trade networks that functioned as biological safety nets. And when we encountered a superiorly adapted species, we literally absorbed their genetic code to bolster our own survival. The Neanderthals represent the ultimate evolutionary lesson. Specializing perfectly for one specific environment is a death sentence the moment that environment changes. We survived because our specialty wasn't strength. Our specialty was adaptability. And that is a survival strategy worth remembering. I'll see you in the next one.